G'day everyone, welcome back to the channel. So in today's video, I want to talk to you about why sleeping funny may not be the cause of your morning pain and stiffness. And instead, I want to talk you through what I think is probably the most missed and common cause of that morning pain and stiffness that we completely overlook. And I think it'll really change your perspective on where your focus needs to be in order to fix those things. And towards the end of the video, I want to tie in some ideas about mattresses and pillows that sort of center around conversations that I have a lot clinically when asked about what the best thing for certain conditions are, like neck pain and back pain. So hang around to the end of the video if you're looking for a little bit more insight into those things. But when we're talking about morning pain and stiffness and symptoms that tend to get worse or tend to feel worse first thing in the morning, it's really common for us to feel like we slept funny or something that happened that night in bed was the reason for that pain. And it makes a lot of sense because often we wake up with soreness, but we didn't go to bed with soreness. So it makes a lot of sense to a lot of people that something must have gone wrong or something must have been the culprit within that period of time, which is obviously when we're asleep. Now, clinically, I think a really good example to highlight this, and we'll circle back around in a second, is if I was to take you guys out, if we went to the gym or went out into a field somewhere and did 1,000 sit-ups, had a race to 1,000 sit-ups, I think most people would understand that if you woke up the next day and your abs were screaming at you, that it makes perfect sense that the obvious 1,000 sit-ups was the thing that gave you that next day muscle soreness. And what tends to happen in that scenario is obviously we fatigue ourselves really heavily, we challenge our tissue beyond maybe what it's used to dealing with. We take that to bed, and when we sleep, our body recovers and it repairs and it restores things. And then we wake up with the consequences of that the next day or potentially even the day after in some cases. Now, I want to propose the idea that it's the exact same thing that happens when we wake up with morning pain and stiffness. It's just that the trigger for that isn't as obvious or as sexy, or it doesn't stand out as much as something like 1,000 sit-ups. So the point I wanted to make here is that what generally tends to happen is the things that you wake up with in the morning or that you experience throughout the early part of the day or even long into the day, depending on the person, is often a direct consequence to something that happened the day before, not necessarily what happened while you were asleep. And that may sound strange to a lot of people, again, because you go to sleep feeling good and you wake up feeling not great. So there must be something that goes in between. But from what I tend to find clinically, when we're talking to patients and trying to sort of backfill the information to come to that conclusion of what's causing it, generally the things that you want to look at from the day before, again, may not be as obvious, as interesting, or as easy to pick up on as something like 1,000 sit-ups or using your body. It actually tends to be the really boring, stationary, everyday postures and positions that we get into throughout that day before. So if you have neck pain, you wake up with neck pain, it's actually far less likely that the 6 or 7 hours that you were asleep, that you're in a bad neck position for that period of time. We know the body rolls around a lot. You're not necessarily in the same position all the time. So it may not necessarily be the pillow that's causing the problem. However, that 5, 6, 7, 8 hours that you're asleep is heavily trumped by the 19, 18, 17 hours that we spend, those waking hours that we spend during the day, in particular neck postures. So if you're someone who sits at a desk all day, if you're someone who plays on the computer a lot, if you drive a lot, if you sit up in bed and read or use your phone a lot, if you play an instrument, if you do something where your head and neck are in a specific position for a length of time throughout the day, or there's a theme throughout the day where your neck's in a less than ideal position, most often looking down or poking that chin out, potentially on computers and things like that, those shapes over time tend to explain the specifics of why and where your neck becomes problematic when you wake up in the morning. And the reason why I say that is in clinic, if you show me where your neck feels a bit stiff and tight in the morning, then we lay you down, we have a feel through the joints to see how they're feeling, feel through the soft tissues. Depending on where the segments are that have become problematic for you in the morning, we can actually correlate to the positions that you get into the day before purely by looking at where you are. So, for example, you can try this at home. If you know where your stiffness and tightness tends to be, if you then put yourself in the position that you get into most often, so for example, if someone's on their phone a lot, it's highly likely that the position that you're going to hinge through the most to get down there is the exact position that starts to grumble at you in the morning. So it's really important to have this perspective that if you're not taking the time to look at the positions and the postures and the shapes that you put your neck into for all of those waking hours, then it's potentially very hard, if not impossible, to stop yourself from feeling crappy in the morning, because we're not taking away the thing that's predominantly challenging the neck and asking it to be sore. And what we're thinking, or what we tend to think happens, is we challenge those tissues in a slightly different way to maybe doing 1,000 sit-ups, where we're not doing a high fatigue load, but at the same time, there's still a type of high fatigue load or a high load that goes through that area, that constant load over time. So when you go to sleep, your body has to recover from that, it has to process that information, it has to try to adapt to that information just in case you go through the same experience again, which we tend to the next day, and then we wake up with those consequences. Now, the same thing tends to happen for anyone who tends to have back pain and soreness and stiffness and dysfunction in the morning. Again, it's not necessarily the sleeping position or the mattress that you sleep on that tends to be the catalyst for that. But again, the same as the neck, there's most likely some everyday boring shapes that you get into throughout the day that correlate to the exact area that you tend to become dysfunctional when you wake up in the morning. So again, we've done a bunch of videos on this before in terms of how this mid to low section of the back can create all these problems down low. So if you wake up with a lot of problems down here, we want to go hunting with the ball, and I'll link the ball exercise up here. We've done it a million times before. And again, if you're hinging through this part of your back, whether it's using the computer, driving the car, sitting into your couch, whatever it is, even if that's just your resting position and you kick a hinge in that part of your back throughout the day, then obviously the more you do that, the more likely you are to wake up with some consequences the next day. And it may not be anything sinister, but again, when you go to sleep, it's very likely that your body has to figure out a way to adapt and to buffer that, and then you wake up with the consequences. So the one thing I guess I want you guys to take from this video is that, yes, sleeping positions, pillows and mattresses do matter to a degree, but you could have the perfect mattress, the perfect pillow, you could have the perfect sleeping position, and that wouldn't necessarily guarantee that your symptoms will go away unless you fix the really boring, mundane things throughout the day. So if you're not trying to put your neck and back into a better position throughout the day, maybe unglue some of that stiffness and tightness with the ball, have some physical therapy, get a massage, whatever it might be. If we're not then putting our tissue into a better position, then it's hard to imagine that it's going to stop magically getting sore and stiff the next day once your body's had a chance to adapt to that overnight. So I think it's a really important conversation to have. Let me know in the comments below what your thoughts are around that. It's really important to take a second to think about not just what you do most often. And remember, it's not the most active things that tend to be the problem, because the body's always moving in and out of certain positions. It's the stationary set shapes that we get into, often the ones that we leave ourselves in and do something else, whether that be watching TV, using our phones. Our focus is elsewhere on a computer, for example. And it's really hard then to center it back on ourselves to see if we're in a really bad sort of rounded, crappy shape, or whether we're in a shape that respects the physiology and the anatomy of our spines. So take a moment while you're watching this video just to think back to the things and the positions you do most often. And I can almost guarantee that you'll figure out one or two really strong leads that you can focus on that will directly relate to the sections of your neck or back that become sore in the morning. So I think that's really important to understand. Now, following on from that, again, the conversations around sleeping funny, morning pain, all those sorts of things are still really important conversations, because as I said before, they still do have an influence over people. We all know someone, if not ourselves, who we switch a pillow and all of a sudden we feel fantastic, or we get a new mattress or a really fancy mattress, pay a lot of money for this, and it feels like our symptoms get better in the morning. Now, what we often see with this is, yes, this has a really good effect, but much like changing a running shoe, it doesn't solve a problem, it just buffers a problem better. So, for example, if you can only sleep really well on a particular mattress or a particular pillow, that tells me that it's compensating for something that you're missing day to day. And that as soon as we take that pillow and mattress away, say you go, excuse me, you go to an Airbnb, you go camping, you go somewhere else where you don't have the luxury of that perfect setup, it tells me that all of a sudden those aches and pains are going to come back again. More likely because you haven't solved that problem, excuse me, and you've also taken away the buffer that helps you tolerate those potentially bad positions throughout the day better. So what's really important to understand is that, particularly for those who are going to go out and, excuse me, and are trying to buy a new pillow or wanting to buy a new mattress, it's really important to focus on those basic shapes and postures first, because there's every chance that you're not going to then have to buy a new pillow and a mattress, provided that your pillow and mattress aren't horribly bad for you or horribly sort of inappropriate for you. Now, just to touch on a couple of things, if you are looking for an ideal pillow, if you're lying on your side, that pillow should clear the gap or cover the gap or fill the gap between the side of your head and the side of your shoulder. So obviously if it's too thin, it's going to allow us to tilt our head and get into an awkward neck position that way. Obviously if it's too thick, it's going to force us into a bad position the other way. Same thing if you're lying on your back. If that pillow is too thick, it's going to leave you in a position where you're essentially hinging forward all night and putting some pressure on your neck. Again, if it's too thin, it can expose some of the dysfunction that people get into if they're so used to being in this position. Excuse me. So obviously there's a bit of a balance and a little bit of trial and error as to what you feel fits best based on sort of your anatomy and your physiology. In terms of mattresses, obviously we value good posture at all times. So it's really important, obviously, when you're sitting, that you're up tall, you have your shoulders back and everything's aligned anatomically, because that's the best expression of those tissues. When we're talking about lying on your side with a mattress, we want to make sure that there's enough give or enough support in that mattress so we're not sinking in certain positions, or we're not bulging out, or there's not too much pressure that is challenging those tissues beyond what they're happy to cope with. Now, again, the nuances of a pillow and a mattress are probably beyond the scope of this video today, but I think it's really important in context to understand that those two things are certainly important in some instances, but they can't solve that dysfunction that's most likely caused before your head even hits the pillow or your butt hits that mattress. So if you can take the time to think about those shapes and postures, you should be able to find some really strong clues as to why your aches and pains tend to be there. If you're not sure where to look, let me know in the comments below, and I can sort of direct you to some common things. Again, whether it's sitting on the couch, sitting at a desk, using a computer, using a laptop, playing an instrument, doing arts and crafts. If you're someone who sits up in bed and reads or uses your phone at night, that's a huge one. Or you use your phone a lot throughout the day, sitting in the car driving, all these common things that we get into are highlighted by constant shapes, and often less than perfect constant shapes that over time can end up causing us some aches and pains in the morning. So that's the main thing that I wanted to get across today. I hope it's an interesting idea. I hope it makes sense. And to finish up, I definitely respect those who feel like it definitely is sleeping funny that's caused it, because it does feel that way, it does appear that way. But ultimately, when you take a step back and you start talking through the things that you do before you get to bed, at least clinically, there's always a perfectly good explanation that we can find that, again, once we tweak that and improve that, we see a resolution in that morning pain and stiffness, if your tissue has that capacity to do that. So I want that for you guys as well, and hopefully you get that from this video. So as always, I appreciate you watching it. If you went on to enjoy it, please consider leaving a like down below. Share this to someone who does have neck pain and stiffness in the morning, back pain and stiffness in the morning, in the hope that it does help them going forwards. And ultimately, if you do like this content, please consider subscribing to the channel and follow me along as we sort of divulge this sort of information going forward. So appreciate you tuning in, and until next time, we'll see you soon.